Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing with If We're Being Honest. This will be Part 7, Chapter 7, entitled Little Monster. Perhaps it was just as well that Todoroki's horrific past had come to light earlier that week. It might possibly soften the blow of what was to come. Of course, Satoshi didn't think that he would experience the absolute emotional backlash of finding out the number 2 turned number 1 hero was an abusive piece of shit ever again, but maybe for everyone else, his history would be a close second. Hitoshi wasn't worried about accidentally saying anything. He had been keeping his mouth shut since he was 5. Literally and figuratively, and therefore he had a lot of practice, but, of course, that had ended up not mattering, because everything always went wrong with him. He should have been used to it at this point. It was during a training exercise when he first fucked up. He wasn't sure why. He was normally completely fine shoving his emotions down, to the point where he was almost a husk of a person, which he was totally fine with, of course he was. He had a lot of practice with that, too. They hadn't worn their hero costume in a few weeks, so it had been a while since he had had to wear his voice changer, which shouldn't have been an issue. He had never had a problem wearing it before, except maybe for the first time. He usually ignored the panic in his chest until it faded away. He was usually fine once his focus shifted to the current goal of the exercise, rather than old, suppressed memories. So why was he hyperventilating? "You good, man?" Kirishima asked, who was one of his teammates. At least he thought he was one of his teammates. He couldn't think of anything other than the current lack of oxygen in his lungs. Despite this, he did his best to suppress his feelings and brush off the other's concern. "I'm having a panic attack." Or not. This quirk would be the death of him. He was pretty sure the redhead immediately went on high alert, which was exactly the response that Hitoshi had been going for. Perfect. "Dude, do you need me to get Mr. Aizawa?" His voice was full of panic, like that would help Hitoshi during his current panic attack. He could hardly blame him, though, as Kirishima had recently spewed his own anxiety demons to the class. Hitoshi could understand. "Yeah," he said against his will, or nearly said it. It probably came out more of a wheeze. He couldn't really tell, because his heartbeat was louder than his brain, and he felt like something was tightening over his ribcage as well. So it was definitely not how he wanted this whole day to go. He was suddenly a child again, and the thing on his face was heavier in a split second. He wanted it off. He needed it off. He started to claw at his face, trying to rid himself of this stupid contraption like he hadn't already tried countless times to no avail. He just needed it off, and he didn't care how hurt he got trying to. He felt moisture hit his fingers, scraping at his cheeks. Was he crying? He didn't think so. He wasn't sure. Strong hands suddenly gripped at his own, causing him to freeze. He stopped clawing at his face, if only because he couldn't anymore, but maybe this person could help him, even if they really only wanted to hurt him. "Get it off," he choked out. "Get it off." "It is off," a deep, soft voice said. "I need you to breathe with me, Shinsou." I can't." He was going to die from being crushed by whatever was around his chest and the object on his face, not suffocation of all things. "Get it off." "It's not there anymore," the man once again said, bringing Hitoshi's hands down to their chest, which was rising and falling evenly. "Copy my breathing. Can you do that for me?" And maybe something about his calm voice helped him calm down, and he found himself able to think a little more clearly. He found it extremely difficult and completely exhausting, but he did his best to match his inhales and exhales with them. And he realized the man was Aizawa, and that he was lying against a wall in ground beta, breathing hard. His voice changer, was in his hands, and he realized that there was blood underneath his fingernails. "Are you all right?" Aizawa asked, slowly taking the device from him and setting it to the side. "Yes, I'm perfectly fine," he thinks. "I don't know, I'm still a bit shaky and out of breath." He was going to find that child. He was going to find that child with that stupid quirk and tear him a new one. "That's okay," his teacher said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Why don't you go see Recovery Girl? Kaminari, go with him." That was the point where Hitoshi realized they were definitely not alone, and all of his teammates from the exercise were close enough to him that it was clear they were obviously worried, but far enough away that it was clear they were uncomfortable. Kaminari looked like a deer caught in headlights. Sir? Are you able to take him or not?" "Of course I am. I just don't know if I'm the most qualified." Aizawa muttered something under his breath, something to do with idiot problem children, and rolled his eyes. "You have working legs and know where to go. That's qualified enough for me. I can't go because I'm the only one supervising this class for now, so I know that I can trust you with this." The blonde looked at his teacher a moment longer before shrugging his shoulders with a grin. Sure thing. Let's go, amigo. He offered his hand to Hitoshi, who couldn't help but simply stare at it for a moment, uncomprehending. When he eventually took it, Kaminari lifted him to his feet, surprisingly not too fast, and slung an arm around his shoulder. He found it strangely endearing and a bit more comfortable than he would have liked to admit. It was then that they were out of earshot that Hitoshi found himself speaking again, voice rough. You don't have to do this. I know where to go. Aizawa's orders, man, Kaminari said with a chuckle. Don't want to get on his bad side. He's not that bad, Hitoshi said. He kind of took me under his wing after the sports festival and helped me to be able to get into the hero course, too. He's actually the closest thing I have to a father figure. He felt his face heat up instantly at his admission, and it wasn't surprised to find Kaminari drop his jaw at that. Aizawa wasn't exactly uncaring. He cared very deeply about each of his students, to the point where he regularly risked his life for them, but he wasn't usually the most affectionate type. Hitoshi, of course, knew the truth. Aizawa loved them all like his own children, and would probably adopt each and every one of them at a moment's notice if they needed it. And maybe the need was already there for Hitoshi, but he didn't want to cause any more trouble for the man that had already helped him so much. Wow, I didn't realize you guys were so close, Kaminari said. Does your dad suck or something? Hitoshi felt his heart skip a beat. He forcefully bit his own tongue to keep himself from impulsively answering, then spoke very carefully. I'm actually in foster care. It's nice being in the dorm, since I'm so used to sharing my space. That was a good deflecting statement he used, right? Well, it turned out to be, since Kaminari took it and ran with it, talking about how great the dorms were and how close everyone had gotten. Hitoshi discreetly let out a breath that he was holding, and then he had to hold back a blush when Kaminari told him how happy he was that he was there and with them, and not that weird purple little creep. I'm glad that I've gotten to know you, dude, he said with a smile before shaking his head at himself. This truth thing really is making me sappy, I guess. I don't mind. I kind of actually like it, Hitoshi answered automatically, and now he needed to really deflect fast before the blonde saw his red face. Can I ask you a question? Shoot. Why did you say you weren't qualified to take me to the nurse? Kaminari almost looked startled for a second, and maybe even a bit scared, but it must have been Hitoshi's imagination, since he was grinning, sheepishly rubbing the back of his neck, not even a moment later. Well, I'm the most likely to get distracted by a bird flying and lose you, so... or just wander off the path in general. Hitoshi couldn't help but laugh. I guess that's true, he said, before adding a jab of his own. You've done a good job so far, so let's just hope no puppies wander onto campus. Kaminari looked incredibly offended. I don't care what the circumstances are. The League could be attacking for all I care. Okay, maybe I'd care a bit then, but never not wish for puppies. Fine, if puppies show up, I give you permission to be 100% distracted. See, that's all I ask of you. Mizuko was pretty concerned when the training ended, and he found out that Shinsou had had a panic attack. He was one of his best friends, and of course he was going to be worried. He was even more so when Aizawa informed them that Shinsou was now with Recovery Girl. Is he okay? He asked frantically before their teacher assured that he was fine and that he had simply scratched himself pretty bad during the attack, which was a bit weird, if Izuku was being honest, but nonetheless he felt relieved that his friend wasn't hurt seriously. Still, he asked Kirishima if Shinsou was okay as soon as they got to the locker rooms, knowing that they had been in the same group together. He said that physically, yes, he was all right, but apparently he had been really worried when Shinsou had seemed to completely disappear into his own mind. I've never seen him like that, man, he said with a low voice, sitting on the bench, making no move to change out of his sweaty clothes. I never would have thought. And it seemed to come out of nowhere, too, did I? He looked up, terrified. Did I do something? I'm sure you didn't do anything, Izuku said immediately. Panic attacks can be caused by any number of things, and I know that he trusts you. Kirishima hummed. Yeah, I guess. Don't go blaming yourself, Katsuki said with a frown before setting a few sparks off in his palms. Don't make me force you to love yourself, either. Kirishima's sweat dropped and gave an awkward grin. Sure thing, bro. We were kissing 20 minutes ago. Do not call me bro. Denki was stupid. Well, it kind of was, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he could tell something was bothering his friend, Crush, besides the obvious. His heart ached for Shinsou, and how his face was pretty much covered in blood, but he forced himself to not stare and instead act like everything was normal. Recovery Girl was able to heal Shinsou, leaving him extremely tired to the point that he was almost fully leaning on Denki. He suspected this was the real reason that Aizawa wanted him to take him there, alongside the obvious. He let Shinsou lean on him all the way to the dorms and tried not to feel too giddy about it. He was simply helping his friend. That was all. Totally. So when they got there, everyone seemed to be hanging out in the common room waiting for them. "Hey, guys," Denki said as he entered and helped Shinsou kick off his shoes. "Is he okay?" Kirishima came up and immediately asked. He looked so distraught, and Denki remembered how scared he had looked earlier when Shinsou had pretty much collapsed to the ground without warning. Of course, Denki had also been terrified when he vaguely heard the words panic attack, followed by the sound of a body falling to the floor. "Other than being about to fall asleep as soon as he hits his bed?" he asked. "He's in shipshape. He's probably so tired because he normally never sleeps, so the healing just sapped all of his leftover energy." "Oh, good," Midoriya said with a relieved sigh. "Why don't we let him take a nap, and when he gets up we'll start the movie night? We can even let him pick the movies." "Sounds good to me," Shinsou slurred from Denki's shoulder, making everyone sweat drop and laugh awkwardly. "Good night, Shinsou," Midoriya said, smiling sadly as Denki helped the other into the elevator. He knew why he looked so upset. It was weird seeing Shinsou be this vulnerable, and it was because of something that he couldn't control. He knew they all desperately wanted to help him, but they just didn't know how. Maybe they would find out soon, since this truth quirk was so great at forcing them to spill their guts. Denki really hoped it didn't come to that, though. As much as he wanted to help his friend, he didn't want him to share his troubles before he was ready. He knew all about troubles. Hopefully nothing would be forced from his own trove of secrets, but he was good at pretending to be happy anyways, so nothing to worry about there. He tucked him into bed, and as he was doing so, Shinsou grabbed his wrist. "Thank you," he muttered sleepily before rolling over and starting to snore. Denki very pointedly ignored the blush on his own cheeks as he left the room. They all hung out in the common room while they waited, mostly doing homework. Denki really wasn't a fan of this quirk, mainly because he could still say stuff he thought was true but actually wasn't. Like he could say the freezing point of water was 100 degrees if he actually thought that, meaning that he could still get all the answers wrong on the worksheet. Totally unfair. And he knew the bushes outside weren't poisonous now because of this fact. He blamed Sero, who had told him this when they had first gotten to the dorms. He laughed quite hard when Denki was told the truth. Hitoshi woke up with a groan, which was weird, at least the waking up part. He didn't remember going to sleep, and he hardly ever woke up at all, but he was more in favor of staying up at night and adding value to the designer eye bags that he had. Then he remembered what had happened, and just groaned louder and shoved his face into his pillow. He trudged down to the common room, still feeling tired, but knowing that he wasn't going to be able to get back to sleep if he tried, and he waved half-heartedly as the elevator doors opened. "Shinsou!" Midoriya said with a smile from the couch, instantly perking up at the sight of his friend. "How are you feeling? Did you sleep well? Do you need to go back to bed? Do you want to help us pick out some—" "I'm fine," he said, before his friend could ask him any more questions. Hitoshi knew that he meant well, but he could be a real chatterbox sometimes. He didn't mind, of course. It was one of the qualities he admired about him, but he just couldn't keep up with the speed of the other's thoughts half the time. "Any movie suggestions, Purple Boy?" Mina asked from the floor where she was browsing through a giant tub of movies. Since they didn't have Wi-Fi and therefore no streaming services, the class had collectively begged Aizawa for movies once they ran out of the ones that they had brought from home. And since UA's budget was so big, they ended up supplying them with more than they would ever need for an entire year. "I don't really know a lot of movies," he said with a shrug. "Pick out whatever you think would be good." "Wait," Kaminari said. "Didn't you say that you didn't watch a lot of Disney?" "Yeah, I didn't watch a lot of anything." "What about Zootopia?" he asked brightly, pulling the disc out. It had a picture of a humanoid fox and a rabbit on it, which was interesting, to say the least. "Sure, why not?" he said with another shrug. "I trust your judgment." Something sparkled in Kaminari's eyes. Epic, man. He ended up between the blonde boy and Midoriya as they waited for the movie to start. Thankfully, no one was asking him any questions about what had happened earlier because he wasn't sure he'd be able to explain it if he tried. Well, that was sort of a lie. He knew exactly what had triggered the panic attack, but the issue was that it usually wasn't an issue. He wouldn't be surprised if it had something to do with this bloody quirk. The movie started, and he tried to get the gist of it. Everyone was an animal, but they could do everything that humans could, including have prejudices and hate things that were different from them. He huffed quietly in his seat. Some things would always be the same, no matter where you were or what anthropomorphic creatures you observed. He thought it was ironically funny, until it suddenly wasn't. The fox in the movie was suddenly a little kid, and he was joining his local club scouts or something. He raised his little paw on the screen. "I, Nicholas Wilde, promise to be brave, loyal, helpful, and trustworthy." even though you're a fox." "What?" Hitoshi watched as the kid was roughly pushed to the floor and held down by the others. "No! What did I do wrong, you guys? No, please. Tell me, what did I do wrong?" His stomach plummeted to his feet when the stupid metal contraption from his nightmares was brought on the screen, and that was when it was forcefully put on the boy. He felt his lungs and heart completely stop working altogether. "What did I do?" The rodent chuckled darkly. "If you thought we would ever trust a fox without a muzzle, you're even dumber than you look." The fox ran from the building, and Hitoshi was vaguely aware that he was now standing up and moving through the panicked haze that he was now stuck in. Next thing he knew, he was on the floor, struggling to get air into his lungs, and staring blankly at the elevator doors right in front of him. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, and he felt like a snake was constricting his chest, but none of that mattered because he knew the stupid thing was back on his face, and he had to get it off. He started to attempt to pry it off, but his hands caught his wrist, and they held him down to its sides. He nearly whimpered, not knowing who was touching him or if they were going to hurt him. He was instantly aware of several bodies around his own, and that made his heart rate pick up. But he really only cared about whoever was holding his hands hostage and forcing him to stay in this hell. One of his hands was suddenly brought up to his chest, right over his heart, which made him freeze. Then his other hand was brought over to someone else's chest, which he could feel a steady heartbeat. Even though it was slightly faster than he somehow knew to be normal, it was dramatically slower and steadier than his own. "Shinsou! Shinsou!" The noise was slowly filtering in. "Shinsou! To copy my breathing. That for me?" He noticed the breathing, and the breathing of the other chest was very up and down, while his own was sporadic and fast, which was weird because it felt like his rib cage was closing in on itself, forcing his lungs to shut down. Nevertheless, he tried to do what he was told, partially because he somehow knew he had to, and partially because another smaller, more childlike part of him knew that doing what he was told would make the pain go away quicker. He forced himself to take even breaths, and got a weird sense of déjà vu when it started working and noise slammed back into him like a bullet train. The movie must have been still playing because he heard some of the weird music. No one had turned it off on their way over because every one of his classmates was now distantly surrounding him and pretty much dissolving into panic themselves. Some of them were muttering encouragement at him, and others were muttering to themselves, and some were just standing with the most paralyzed expressions on their faces. If the circumstances were different, Hitoshi might have even laughed. He coughed roughly instead, as the greedy lungfuls of air that he was now getting were a shock to his system. A hand was on his back, rubbing soothing circles. He looked over and saw it was Kaminari, who smiled at him shakily. "Hey, man," he whispered. "Hey," Hitoshi said, sounding broken and like he had been eating glass, and feeling like it too. "Are you all right?" came a voice from in front of him. He turned his head again to see Midoriya sitting there, still holding Hitoshi's hand to his chest like it was fragile and precious. "Maybe," he managed to choke out. "I don't know, probably not." Someone must have finally paused the TV because the silence rang throughout the room. "Let's scoot over a bit, yeah?" Midoriya said softly, helping Hitoshi slide back so that he could lean against the back of the couch. He did so gratefully, exhausted from what had just happened. "Here," Uraraka said, handing him a glass of water. He thanked her before downing the entire thing faster than he ever had before, including after intense workouts. It slightly concerned him. "You thirsty?" Bakugo asked nonchalantly, making Hitoshi give a light snort. He was kneeled down next to him, too, which would have normally surprised Hitoshi, but there had been so many surprises these past few weeks that it just somehow felt right that he was by his side, so he didn't question it. "Thank you," he said again as he gave the glass back to the girl. I'm sorry you guys had to see that." "It's totally fine, Shinsou," Midoriya said. "Maybe—" He looked up at him nervously like he was going to breach a sensitive subject, and knowing him, he probably was. "Maybe you could tell us your triggers so you don't have to go through that alone anymore. We could help you avoid them." And Hitoshi knew he meant well. Of course he did, but that didn't stop the raw fear that flashed through his heart at the question and the blood that he almost drew from his lips from biting so hard. Maybe he could talk around the subject and speak very, very carefully. "I don't want you guys to be inconvenienced by me," he said. "You're not an inconvenience," Todoroki said, and Hitoshi realized that he was right next to him, too, between Midoriya and Kaminari. "If I'm not one with my garbage baggage, then you aren't either." "Shoto!" "What?" He couldn't help but smile at the light banter between the couple. Maybe Todoroki had a point. Every other person had been accepted for who they were in the past, even Bakugo, who had straight up bullied Midoriya for years. If they could forgive him and support Kirishima, and Mina, and Sue and Yamomo, and Midoriya, and Todoroki, well, maybe they could accept him too. He turned to the boy who was still absent-mindedly rubbing his back. "Remember what I told you on our walk?" he asked Kaminari with a sad smile. "That you were in foster care," he said instantly. Hitoshi knew the blonde was smart, but not that smart. Screw everyone else for calling him dumb, when he could make connections that fast. He hummed his confirmation. "It's because my parents dumped me on the side of the road as soon as my quirk developed. I was homeless for days before a pro hero had found me and sent me to the authorities, and somehow it even got worse." The words had slipped out of his mouth like butter, leaving him completely 100% mortified. He had only meant to say that his parents had given him up, not that foster care was less than ideal. That was not what he had just implied. "That's horrible," Kirishima said, clearly near tears. Hitoshi still found all of this caring about him business very weird. "Your parents were Corcus jerks. You didn't deserve any of that." "Yeah, don't listen to a word they said," Bakugo insisted, arms crossed and looking downright murderous. "Just 'cause they gave birth to you doesn't mean shit." "If only they were the only ones," he answered before regret filled him once again. Many members of their class expressed their disdain for this truth quirk, and he was truly starting to understand the full-bodied loathing that they all had. "Anyone else that did anything to hurt you was wrong, Shinsou," Jiro said, kneeling down next to him and grasping his free hand tightly. "Even if they saw you as a villain for something that you had no control—" "Wait!" Her suddenly voice was now filled with horror, and her eyes widened. She slowly turned to face him dead on, and somehow knew that she had figured it out. She was a smart one, just like Kaminari. "The movie, that scene, your quirk, the voice changer." She trailed off, clearly horrified by what she had realized, and not wanting to say it out loud. He was sure if anyone else understood it, they weren't voicing it yet, so he decided to just go ahead and bite the bullet. "The muzzle," he finished. He said it so silently that you could have heard a pin drop over him, but he knew for a fact that all of them had heard, if only because of the intense, death-like silence that followed. He felt a hand that was on him, and it tightly gripped his arm, and he wasn't too shocked to realize it was Bakugo, who was looking at him with pained eyes while biting his lip. He gave him a tiny, strained smile. The blonde didn't return it. "Why didn't you tell me?" a new voice asked brokenly. And no, he was not expecting to look up and see Aizawa standing in the doorway. "How long have you been there?" he couldn't help but ask. He then noticed that Ida was standing off to the side of the door, breathing hard and steam coming from his engines, so he must have ran and got their teacher when he started to have a panic attack because he was responsible and all of that other annoying crap. "Long enough," Aizawa said as he started to walk over. "You said your foster homes weren't that bad, and that you were fine in the system." He knelt down in front of him right between Midoriya and Bakugo, and Hitoshi could see the pain in his eyes as he muttered almost as a joke, "God, I don't know why I believed you." "I'm pretty convincing," he said, half joking, half serious. Aizawa smiled at him sadly. "I told you I could have gotten you out. Why did you say no?" "A lot of reasons, I guess," he whispered, not noticing how he was physically closing in on himself. "I was going to be living in the dorms anyway, and it's horrible, you know. I was this little monster who wasn't allowed to speak, ever. If I did, it was shoved on my face for days, and if I tried to speak while it was on," he bit his tongue to keep himself from scaring his classmates. "It wasn't pretty." "I'm so sorry," Aizawa said as he put a hand on his shoulder. Hitoshi didn't even care anymore as he started to pull at his own hair. Words slipped out brokenly and unintentionally, and maybe even somewhat intentionally a little, almost like he had been wanting to say them for so long, but didn't have the courage or strength to before. "And I didn't want to burden you, since you had already done so much for me. And I didn't want to pile fixing my garbage life onto the list, even if you're the closest things I've got to a dad." Aizawa then did something totally unexpected, and yet completely expected at the same time. He hugged him. "And you've become like a son to me," he whispered, quiet enough that no one else would hear. He wasn't crying. He wasn't, and he definitely didn't suppress a sob as he hugged his mentor. Father figure? Back. "Do you want to come to my place?" Aizawa asked, just as quiet as before. "We can deal with everything in the morning." "Yeah," he said through the lump that was in his throat, "but can we finish the movie first?" He said that part loudly enough that everyone else was able to hear, and hopefully it did the trick and lighten the mood. Plus, he wanted to see someone who was seen as a villain and went through what he went through get a happy ending, even if it was just a silly cartoon. "Of course, Purple Boy," Mina choked out with a forced laugh to go with it. "You heard him. Movies and cuddle times, pronto. We love you. We love you so much, so don't you ever forget it, okay?" Tearful, enthusiastic words of agreement filtered into his ears. He just cried harder, burying his head against Aizawa's neck and gripping his shirt tightly to hide how much he was shaking. And soon enough, movies and cuddle time it was, with Aizawa's arm over his shoulders and Midoriya on his other side, with Kaminari, Kirishima, and Bakugo all sitting in front of his legs. He'd never felt so loved and appreciated before. His only wish would have been to get rid of the tears in his eyes so he could see the movie properly. And the fox did get a happy ending. Maybe he could, too. They arrived at Aizawa's little apartment on campus after midnight, where Yamada was still grading papers in the kitchen in his pajamas. It was weird seeing his hair down, even if he had already seen it so many times before. "Hey, babe," he said as he glanced up before doing a double take. "And hey to you too, little listener. What brings you here so late?" Hitoshi glanced at Aizawa, and hopefully conveyed his plea for help with his eyes. Thankfully, he understood. "We'll talk in the morning," the man said quietly, and his tone obviously made the other instantly on alert, so he was quick to ease his husband's nerves. "Everything's okay now, just no, we'll have another reason to ask Nezu for a bigger apartment." Yamada seemed to understand immediately, while Hitoshi most certainly did not. "Gotcha," he turned to him with a kind expression. "I can show you the guest room, although I guess it's your room now, unless Nezu wants to actually give us some more space, and if he's going to have Eri living here, too, the little demon mouse." "My room?" he asked, almost in a daze. "Am I missing something here?" "Yeah, your stuff to go put in your room, but we'll figure that out later. You'll still sleep in the dorms, of course, but this'll be for breaks and school vacations." Aizawa gave him a sly smile, the same one that he had whenever he handed out a multiple-choice quiz and made all of the answers but one B. "I told you I would get you out of there, didn't I?" "Wait, you mean—" His smile just grew. "You said I was like a father to you, right?" His words were cut off with a grunt as Hitoshi practically tackled him in a hug. His throat was tight, but he somehow managed to speak. "Thank you." Because this was all he had ever really wanted, for as long as he could remember. And Hitoshi would be sure to not tell anyone how choked up that Aizawa sounded when he ran his fingers through his hair and answered, "No problem, child." And Yamada joined the hug not too long after that, and for a wonderful moment they all just stood in the kitchen not caring about the rest of the world. They both led him to his room shortly after that, where for once he had found himself actually able to fall asleep, even if it was on a bumpy old guest mattress that they had promised to replace as soon as possible, because for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was home, and he had never slept so soundly in his whole life. This concludes Chapter 7 of If We're Being Honest. Chapter 8 will be up next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.